so-called free thinkers when it's buy one get one free at the Aldi or whatever, you know. Fucking I mean, like that's
or
the
buy
thing.
one get one free thinkers.
Yeah. Oh my god. Hey.
Hello. Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaging in a radical self-education.
Right, we're just two of a quantity slowly agglomerating, and suddenly they will undergo extreme, drastic qualitative change that then is reflected upon all society.
Very good.
Kind of. I was struggling. I was like doing my notes earlier, and I was like, what the fuck am I going to say about Stalin? Like, I was listening. I was like, do I say I were Stalin's strongest soldiers? There's always a part of me that's like, someone's going to listen to this as their first episode and hear me say, we're Stalin's strongest soldiers, and be like, oh, God, and immediately dip.
I don't know.
Doesn't matter. You know?
This time we are reading The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord.
Guy Debord. Debord.
Yes, so I've always pronounced his name Guy Debord.
Yeah.
I've heard some folks say Debord. I am a Midwesterner situated right on the edge of Appalachia, so my pronunciation of French should not be held as some standard, but
I think I'm taking the misheard tactic here, where I'll just say something kind of in the middle and you'll hear the correct version, right?
Nice.
And I think Debord is that, you know, because it's if I go enough on the R, then it doesn't sound like an R, and it sounds like I'm saying Debord,
Yeah.
Debord.
Yeah, I think this is going to be just like the Marcuse or Marcusa episode. We just pick one and run with it. And if we're mispronouncing it, feel free to let us know at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, we read The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord.
Yes.
Guy Debord, French philosopher, social critic, filmmaker, self-proclaimed doctor of nothing, and most importantly, Marxist. Guy Debord was one of France's, and by extension the world's, preeminent intellectuals of the mid-20th century. Born in Gay, Paris in 1931, Debord initially went to university in Paris to study law, but withdrew from the school before completing any degree. At the ripe young age of 18, Debord became co-founder of the Letterist International and later became a prominent figure of the Situationist International, where Debord was a key figure in the Paris Uprising of 1968. A vociferous reader and an even more devoted drinker, Debord ultimately died by suicide in 1994, but Debord's unique observations around the eponymous spectacle, society's obsession with vanity and commodification, and an acute critique of capitalism's contradictions that has proven more and more prescient with time, continue to live on, inspiring young intellectuals, philosophers, and Marxists today.
Hell yeah.
And yes, the Society of the Spectacle, I did not write a formal introduction for this, but I do know it was written in 1967.
Yes.
And you hear a lot of folks talk about it as one of the seminal texts in inspiring the Paris Uprising.
Sure.
So there's that.
Yeah. I think that there's definitely moments in this book where you can tell it was written in 67. You know, there's a lot of revolutionary energy in that era, and I think you can feel a bit of that here, especially because, as with many of the new philosophical figures of the post-war years, post-World War II, it's clear that he's not in favor of the alternative to capitalism that's currently on the global stage.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm sure we'll have to get into a little bit of that there.
Yeah, I think he's interestingly situated as a Marxist in that much of the latter half of this book is a pretty harsh criticism of actually existing socialism. Yes. So I think we will get into that. Certainly. I also think his alternative is a hand wave.
We've been preconditioned at this point, I will say. The thing that I was thinking about the most was the fact that we've read direct rebuttals to this argument before already, you know? So,
and that's something fun I'll mention is that we're at episode 19 at this point. For almost every episode up until this point, the text was almost entirely, if not entirely, fresh to me.
Yeah.
I'd never read most of what we've read before. The only exception to that up until this point was Conquest of Bread, which I had read. I didn't mean for that to rhyme. Which I had read previously. And now this, The Society of the Spectacle. When I was a young, burgeoning Marxist, I was looking for stuff to read that wasn't the Manifesto and Capital,
sure,
which are the things that everyone tells you that you need to read. And as I was going through, I read a lot of short things that I could get quickly from like the Marxist archive or whatever. Yeah. But this came into my view.
Yes.
I don't remember exactly how, and I thought it was really interesting at the time, but I didn't get a lot of it. I will say, I feel like I understood the central thesis that he was getting at, but I didn't understand the context, and certainly didn't understand the historical references that he's making. And I think reading it a second time, that became a lot clearer to me.
That's great to hear.
Nice.
I think that I'm actually very much looking forward to, much with like the Mercuse, how he said that I think that this will be a great book for a reread. In fact, when I was ordering my copy, I saw that there is an annotated version.
Oh, really?
Which I was actually a little bit interested, but I wanted to stay true to form, so I got this one instead. But I think that something like that's heavily annotated would be pretty helpful.
Yeah.
I also know that, and this might be something we want to put on the list, is that he wrote an additional piece, a corollary, comments on Society of the Spectacle. So there is a so-called sequel to this, as well as a movie, which I've heard has not aged well. It's more of a documentary.
His films in general are not things that I think most people are going to be interested in.
Yeah, I did like my wide net scrawl, as I do, which is much harder now that Internet Archive is not available. And it seemed like mostly still images with text overlaid, which I was not really keen on.
He has an entire film that is either a black screen or a white screen with sounds and occasional text. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, he was of the avant-garde filmmaker bent. And I will say, here's the one random bit of historical trivia that I know, even though he is very clearly an anti-Stalinist.
Yeah.
It was not beyond Debord to take an authoritarian stand and kick people out of the situation.
Oh, yeah?
He was the only standing member for a long time.
Oh, wow.
He kicked every other member out. So despite his anti-Stalinist rants in this, he's got a little bit of that in him.
Okay. Yeah, I see you, Debord. So before we get into the book, one thing I do want to say is that something that you said is about reading small things. We're running out of small works.
Yeah.
We are running out of small works to read. Listener, if you're listening and you have other small works that we have not hit yet, let us know at leftandrightfeedback@gmail.com. All right, let's get into it.
Yeah. How do you think we should start?
I think the best place to start is really just to ask the question, what the fuck is the spectacle?
I agree. I wrote defining the spectacle as the first thing because he gives you about 40 different definitions.
Yeah, let's see here. So I wrote down, every time he says the spectacle is...
Yeah.
I wrote down something here in the category, what is a spectacle? And I have 17 things.
Yeah.
Not to count the 1 through 6 I've lumped together in the first, paragraph 1 through 6 I've lumped together into the first bullet point. There's quite a lot here into spectacle. So, take us away, Aaron. What is the spectacle?
Well, from paragraph 2, the spectacle is a concrete inversion of life, an autonomous movement of the non-living. Does that make it clear?
No. That was, the funniest thing. I get to flesh out a lot of my thoughts with Carissa, obviously. And I was like, yeah, we're talking about the spectacle. It's great. It's autonomous movement of the non-living. Simply the affirmation of appearance and the affirmation of all life as mere appearance. And she was like, okay.
Yeah. I think if there is one detriment to this book, it is that I think last time we were talking about existing too concretely in the material world and having no room for the metaphysical.
Yeah.
I think we might have course corrected a little too much with this text, where I think Debord, as a philosopher, is much more interested in the metaphysical, and so will sometimes even offer materially contradictory terms to try to get at a deeper metaphysical truth, what Tim O'Brien would call the back of the throat truth or the story truth versus the happening truth. This is the difficulty. I think the spectacle is something that you have to piece together a pretty clear definition of through all of the different descriptions around its definition that it gives you, even though some of them might feel contradictory. So, if someone's like, what is the spectacle? It's like, how much time do you have?
Right. Yeah.
Well, number 4.
The
spectacle is a social relation between people that is mediated by images.
Yes.
Number 6, it is the omnipresent affirmation of the choices that have already been made in the sphere of production and in the consumption implied by that production.
Number 10, he says, the spectacle is the affirmation of appearance, the affirmation of all human life, namely social life, as mere appearance.
Yep.
So spectacular literally has to do with sight. That's one thing.
Yeah.
In fact, he says that that's the main sense at this point, where in previous epochs, it used to be touch. So
that's an interesting take, but I think it is one that in 1967 probably felt true, and 2024 probably feels more true, in that because we're now inundated with images and information at all times.
Yeah.
we are not only spectacularly, meaning like from the sense of sight, being bombarded with imagery, we are also being spectacularly watched all of the time in a way that makes that kind of sight probably the most foremost.
Yeah, it's actually interesting to think the apparatus that he's referring to when he's talking about mass indirect communication is mass media, which is primarily through television, right? I guess newspaper too. But if we were to extend it to this day, it would be the internet. You know, it's clearly something, but it's the same mode, so to speak. It's still sight-based. You know, although it might be, I'm getting too caught up in the sight aspect of it. I think that's the problem here, because I'm thinking about how we're shifting in the future, you know, like towards not being able to trust what we see even, and like the tacit understanding that seeing should not be believing, you know, like with AI and things.
Wouldn't that just be a further affirmation of the spectacle, though? The idea that it is this negation of life, as he calls it, that we can no longer even trust our sense of vision to be like an affirmation of life?
I mean, I see what you're saying. I just don't know what it would be instead then. You know, it's like, I'm too caught up in the sight aspect of it. You know, I think that's the thing, because it's ill-defined what the spectacle is here.
Yeah.
I think that the best definition of the spectacle for me is the idea of this autonomous movement of self-preservation of the system. You know, when he talks about the Soviet critique and he says that the spectacle is so fantastic that it can continue this autonomous system without even bourgeois. You know, like it's a bourgeois system without the bourgeois in it. That was pretty interesting to me.
I think that I would agree with that. He calls it self-preservation. Like you said in paragraph 10, the affirmation of appearances and an identification of all human social life with appearances, I think is probably the strongest description of what it is. The idea that we take an image that is fed to us as being equal to the reality that we live in, and how that perpetuates all of these things like commodity fetishism and things like that. He calls it in paragraph 21, the bad dream of a modern society in chains, and ultimately expresses nothing more than its wish for sleep.
Right. It's the guardian of sleep. I like that. Sleep in this sense is like literally rest. Like literally rest. Like rest from toil, rest from labor. And he's saying within like this liberation of labor, there is still privation. That's something that I really liked later on when he's talking about, let's take it to paragraph 14.
Okay.
Because he says in paragraph 14, in the spectacle, which is the image of the ruling economy, the goal is nothing, development, everything. The spectacle aims at nothing other than itself. So it's that self-preservation, right? It's not concerned with anything else. And on top of that, that idea of no goal, just development. Development is not a goal, it's a continual process. And within that development, if the creation of that abundance doesn't guarantee the end of the privation, that's because it includes the privation within it, right? That's something that he says later on. On paragraph 44, if consumable survival is something which must always increase, this is because it continues to contain privation. If there's nothing beyond increasing survival, if there's no point where it might stop growing, this is not because it is beyond privation, because it is enriched privation.
We do have slightly different translations.
We do? Yeah. What does yours say?
Consumable survival must constantly expand because it never ceases to include privation. If augmented survival never comes to a resolution, if there is no point where it might stop expanding, this is because it is itself stuck in the realm of privation. It may gild poverty, but it cannot transcend it.
Mine doesn't even say that at all. It doesn't have another sentence after that.
That's a banger line, too.
Fuck, dude.
I think we'll be fine.
I'm not worried about it. It's just, but yeah, it's because the abundance isn't abundance at all. Within that abundance is actually the other side of the coin here, right?
Yeah.
So it's part of the spectacle. The spectacle exists to preserve itself, right? It continues to develop. The goal is no goal at all. The continuous development is part of the process, and within that development includes all of the privation and exploitation inherent to capitalism.
Yep.
But not just capitalism, as Debord says, also bureaucratic communism, or state capitalism. I don't think he ever labels it anything in particular, you know? I've seen online people refer to it as pseudo-communism, which I'm against because it's socialism for me. That's all I got. Leave me out of this pit, Aaron.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that this is part of where, when I read this the first time, part of what immediately spoke to me and part of what left me a little befuddled is that I felt this innate understanding of what the spectacle is, because I felt very much like there's a self-evident aspect to it. This idea that we live in some sort of contrived reality that perpetuates itself by getting us to buy into it as the representation of what reality is, rather than our lived experience telling us that reality is maybe something a little bit different. So that spoke to me, and I understand that, but he gets so deep into it that I was getting a little lost the first go round, and this time round I think I understand it a little bit better, but still, when he gets in the weeds about some of these things, I can still have a little trouble like wrapping my head around it. So your struggle with putting it all together into a neat little package, I think, is indicative of the work itself, not a failure on your end or anything like that, because I certainly don't have anything to say to like wrap it up and make it any.
Maybe I think it's part of Debord's critique itself, where he says that theory has to come into being via practice, right? The theory of the spectacle also comes into being via practice. He's not content to just have it in words. It is also lived by us, and that's what gives the text its truth. It's the fact that we can recognize it even without having that perfect little package, like you said.
Yeah.
So, thanks. That's a little bit reassuring, because holy fuck.
The way that I've articulated what we're doing here with this show is like to try to find answers about praxis.
Yeah.
But we're doing that by studying theory.
Theory, not actually practicing it.
Yeah, and I think that that's obviously an error.
Damn, dude. Fuck. Yeah.
And so I'm like in this space where it's like theory can only ever tell us why. It's never going to tell us how or what, even, to a certain degree. You know what I mean? Like that comes from like boots on the ground, dirt under your fingernails, like that sort of shit, And I feel like that's part of this self-perpetuating cycle of the spectacle in that it like perpetuates from a revolutionary standpoint. I think where the spectacle still comes into play is that there is a narrative that something different is insurmountable, that it's not possible.
Yeah.
And it is so muddied how the path to get to something different could even be tread.
Right.
That we live under I don't want to speak for you. I live under this fantasy that there is no path at all. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's obviously like not good.
But I think that, so I love that though, because it's completely in line with the spectacle that he's talking about. On paragraph 23, he says that the spectacle is the diplomatic representation of hierarchic society to itself, where all other expression is banned. Less so that it's banned, but more so that it's literally not visible, right? If we want to talk about the spectacle as in like sight, you cannot see an alternative because the spectacle has pushed it outside of the realm of your your purview. That's not what I wanted to say there, but it's fine. And on top of that, our expression currently of dissatisfaction with the system is commodified. Yes, that's real. Like, that's just a fact, and it's something that we have to struggle with. Like, my joke brain was like, the podcasting platform is a tool of the system meant to contain dissatisfaction, right? It's meant to crystallize all of this fury, all of this rage. It's meant to crystallize it into something purely theoretical, purely contemplative, right? Not practical at all. I just said contemplative there because it's what he says when he's talking about the separation of the division of labor, where he says that man's work has become more and more contemplative, less and less practical. The more you see your needs being fulfilled in what the world is providing, the less you actually understand what the fulfillment of your needs will require, right? By podcasting and by us listening to these podcasts, we are literally pushing the practical steps out of our mind.
Yeah.
Not that I'm saying like, end it all now, we got to get out on the fucking streets, but it is something to consider. I mean, it stabbed me in the heart when you said that, not because you meant to insult me or because I was insulted by you, but because it was like, damn, dude, you're right. We're looking for practical solutions in a theoretical world, and it's not going to happen that way.
And that's part of where I feel like people can get in these cycles where you can be the most well-read Marxist in the world, and what is there to show for that? And I think the point in paragraph 24, Debord writes, it should be understood that this apparatus is in no way neutral and that it has been developed in accordance with the spectacle's internal dynamics. To your point, the system isn't broken. It's operating exactly as it's designed to operate. And it's that, quote, controlled opposition. Chomsky and Parenti both talk about this, about basically corralling in what is the acceptable discourse, and then we are allowed to fight with one another inside the reins of this corral.
Yeah.
And that gives us the sense that we're doing something to stand against it. But what that is actually the spectacle still working exactly as it should, still working in accordance with its own internal dynamics, because we're never pushing ourselves outside of those arbitrary boundaries that have been set by the spectacle.
You know what, honestly, it makes me think of is like bipartisan unity, you know? It's like, oh, we can have these political discussions, but at the end of the day, it's not going to harm me. I can still be friends with you. And it's like, that's the spectacle. Yeah. It should push you to the point where you do something. It should push you to action, right? Not that I'm saying like war against the Republicans now or anything, but like it should put you to action, but the suppression of society prevents action from happening. The status quo continues, even though there's clearly a contradiction between the two viewpoints.
Yeah. Not to reduce it in such a elementary way, but I mean, if the Democrats, for example, truly believed the rhetoric that they were using in maybe not outright calling the Republicans fascists, but indicating that they have fascist attitudes, or the fear-mongering that they do around Project 2025, if that were true, why the fuck would they allow a peaceful transfer of power?
Yeah. No, seriously. I mean, you know, Kamala saying Trump's a fascist, he's going to be an authoritarian dictator, and then it's like, well, he won fair and square, I guess we'll just hand it over, right? Yep. If you truly think that Trump is Hitler in power and Hitler's going into office, then you should be planning fucking Operation Valkyrie 2 right now.
Go into a fucking restaurant, they charge you $2.50 for a soda. On the way out, you should blow that place up.
Yeah, because it's like, it's all within the confines in accordance with the internal dynamics of the spectacle, as Debord says. Like, they're all still members of the same fucking country clubs, they all still go do all the same sort of shit because it's a ruse, it's a play, it's theater.
Just to speak on that, one of my categories I had written was unity and division, because he does have, that's one of the titles of the chapter basically, but looking at paragraph 59, I love that whole thing. He says, firstly, this reflects the simple fact that dissatisfaction itself became a commodity as soon as economic abundance could extend production to processing of such raw materials. I love that. It's like the economy became so developed at some point that it could just subsume any critique of capitalism. We know that capitalism is strong enough to do that. But thinking about the Democrats, I love even the line above where it says, the smug acceptance of what exists is like really poignant to me right now, because it's, have you heard it in the last 3 weeks? It's like, this is the choice we have. You know, this is the, like, I wish I could have done something else, but I had to choose between these two options. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole election in a nutshell. You know, the smug acceptance of what is. Fuck, man.
Yeah. What's funny is that section from paragraph 59, I'll read the version of it that I have here, because there's a chunk that spoke to me a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. The vestiges of religion and of the family, the latter is still the primary mechanism for transferring class power from one generation to the next, along with the vestiges of moral repression imposed by those two institutions, can be blended with ostentatious pretensions of worldly gratification precisely because life in this particular world remains repressive and offers nothing but pseudo-gratification. That quote got me thinking about Engels. Yeah. I'd read a little bit of Origin of the Family or whatever. I've read a little bit of that. And in this context, I don't know, I was thinking a lot about the role that things like religion and family play in the perpetuation of the spectacle, mm-hmm. and in the perpetuation of class division, class warfare, and how, I don't know, the things that we tell ourselves that allow us to perpetuate toxic relationships with other people, because it's all just still part of the kind of confines of the internal mechanization of the spectacle.
I think that the most interesting thing about that is the idea that the society of the spectacle imposes its own rules on itself, right? It imposes its own boundaries, separate from like the natural confines, you know? Something to add on to that, just like how we have defined the family, right, as the nuclear family, which mm-hmm. is an extension of capitalism, something he talks about in the end when he talks about time. You know, we construct periods of time within our own sense. I mean, religion creates its own time by mandating an arbitrary starting point, right? The birth of Christ or whatever. In the same way, we've constructed a week and a weekend, right? A vacation is something that works cyclically. We're meant only to look forward to it, not to think of the vacation as anything inside of it. Just like, oh, that's vacation. It's time chiseled away from, it's almost like the negation that's being held for observation, right? It's like vacation is your leisure time. The rest of the year is working, guaranteed.
Yeah.
Anything that's not vacation is then by definition work. By setting that period, that pseudo-cyclical time, it lends itself to its own method of control.
Yeah.
Imposing its own rules is really what speaks to me there. The question I just had for a second was like, how the fuck did we get here? I don't think he really talks about that. He does talk about the transition historically into capitalism, but I don't think he really talks about like the creation of the spectacle as a whole, does he? That's an interesting question that I'm having this second. Maybe it's just something that I've missed. How did the spectacle come to be, right? How present was the spectacle historically?
Yeah, and that implies a question about how intentionally built was it?
Yeah, it's weird. It's weird.
Is it a byproduct of the kind of alienated consumption that he talks about, or is alienated consumption a byproduct of the spectacle?
He says something. Yeah, it's when he's talking about time. He says that I'm looking at 153, where he says, consumable pseudo-cyclical time is spectacular time, both as the time of consumption of images in the narrow sense and the image of consumption of time in the broad sense.
I was reading that from a much more surface level than you were, this commentary on time, specifically on paragraph 153. The bit that spoke to me in that paragraph is where he writes, thus the time that modern society is constantly seeking to save by increasing transportation speeds or using packaged soup ends up being spent by the American population in watching television 3 to 6 hours a day. As for the social image of the consumption of time, it is exclusively dominated by leisure time and vacations, moments portrayed like all spectacular commodities at a distance and as desirable by definition. Kind of your point.
Yeah.
But I think that that's something on a surface level that I've thought about a lot since I left my job.
Yeah.
Is that I now have a lot more time to do with what I wish. And I, by most people's metrics, quote, waste a lot of my time doing things that certainly don't advance a revolutionary cause and have like any grander meaning in that sense. And it's like, I've liberated myself to a degree from a certain amount of toil by leaving my work and no longer being forced to work a certain number of hours at a certain number of days a year, that sort of thing, right? Like I now have control over that to a degree, but I'm using this now liberated time to continue to participate in my observation of the spectacle. I watch a lot of YouTube.
Yeah.
I fucking play on my guitar a little bit,
It's so interesting because it's saying, it's literally what he's saying, where he's saying like the time that you spent otherwise, you don't even know what to do with it. The only thing you can do with it is reaffirm the society around you. And with the TV example, he's literally talking about sight. He's like having the images projected into your brain about celebrity, like, what society should look like, what your time should look like, what products will fulfill your needs. That's something that was interesting that he talks about, is the fact that the commodity imposes itself as the solution. It imposes itself as the solution to your needs, and it prevents you from actually understanding what those needs even are.
Yeah, he tells us that we transform from worker to consumer.
It's not just about the consumption, right? But the appearance, isn't that what he says? It's not just about using anymore, but appearing to use.
Yeah, I took that to be much more like Keeping Up with the Joneses kind of thing, like the appearance of success or the appearance of happiness through intense alienated consumption. He calls that commodity colonization.
Where is that?
That's in 41. With the Industrial Revolution's manufactural division of labor and mass production for a global market, the commodity finally became fully visible as a power that was colonizing all social life. It was at that point that political economy established itself as the dominant science and as a science of domination. There's that.
Dude, oh my God, it is unending. The amount of times he goes, working hard or hardly working. Am I bunga unga or unga bunga? I was sick of it. And I love that. That's one of my favorite rhetorical devices. And I was fucking furious because he kept going,
Keeps doing it.
The domination of science or the science of domination.
Yeah.
It means nothing. It means nothing. It doesn't mean nothing is the problem, is that he uses it very well here. Even in what I was just reading, where he says the consumption of images or the image of consumption.
Yeah.
Fuck!
But he says commodification is not only visible, we no longer see anything else.
This is certainly not the same in your book, but I just want to read it because it's so good. In 44, he says, the spectacle is a permanent opium war which aims to make people identify goods with commodities and satisfaction with survival that increases according to its own laws. I just thought that was so great. A permanent opium war.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually that same paragraph where he says the abundance doesn't stop growing, not because it's beyond privation, but because it contains it.
Yeah.
I'm looking back at 36 now,
Okay.
where he says, the tangible world is replaced by a selection of images which exist above it and which simultaneously impose themselves as the tangible par excellence. And you know what it made me fucking think of, dude? Plants love Brawndo because it's got electrolytes. It's what plants crave, you know? Literally, like, I think that that's a fantastic example of exactly what Debord is saying here, where he's saying, like, the need is thirst, right? And normally the response would be drink something, water, presumably, okay? But this commodity, Brawndo, has imposed itself. What do you think now when you think of thirst? Well, I think of Gatorade, or I think of whatever, right? I don't think of drinking to quench my thirst. I think of, like, what drink do I want to buy? Even on top of that, that kind of illusion of choice that he's talking about, like, do I get the Gatorade or do I get the propel the propane. Yeah, right. It's like the more of those things there are, the less of the original problem is actually being addressed. I mean, those things will all satisfy your thirst, I'm sure, but they're not actually the appearance of drinking the Gatorade is then the contention that you're solving by drinking Gatorade, not I'm thirsty. You know, it's like I'm signaling, like, I understand the commodity form. I understand that Gatorade has electrolytes, which plants crave, right? It's like, dude, fucking the first half of this book, banging.
What's funny about this is kind of an aside, but I'm thinking about your example here about like the Gatorade or the Propel or whatever. Yeah. And how we have this appearance of so many choices and how that obfuscates the kind of real problem at its heart is made even more satirical from the view that most of those things are all made by the same people, the same factories, and they just have different labels, which is why, fucking 50 companies had the listeria outbreak or whatever it was?
Yeah.
Because it's like, just because there are different labels doesn't mean it's different shit.
Right. Well, even on the flip side of that, like even if we're talking about the alternative that's in opposition, it's that same thing, right? He says, this is what I was referring to earlier about that assimilation. Oh, would you look at that? This is actually the quote also I was looking for a second ago. At the top, this satisfaction, which no longer comes from the use of abundant commodities, is now sought in the recognition of their value as commodities. The use of commodities becomes sufficient unto itself. The consumer is filled with religious fervor for the sovereign liberty of the commodities. Wow. Just when the mass of commodities slides toward puerility, the puerile itself becomes a special commodity. This is epitomized by the gadget, the knick-knack, okay? One who collects the keychains which have been manufactured for collection accumulates the indulgences of the commodity, a glorious sign of his real presence among the faithful. Reified man advertises the proof of his intimacy with the commodity. That's all I have there.
Yeah, I will say I wrote collector impulse next to this, my collector impulse next to this, because I felt seen and attacked by this in a way that made me a little uncomfortable with myself. I had to have a conversation with myself because I definitely am a collector of things. When I get into something, I get into it pretty hard and I fall victim to the kind of commodity fetishization that comes with that. So, you know, I play guitar, I buy 12 guitars. I need an amplifier, I buy 9 amplifiers. You know what I mean? Like I go pretty hard on it, and it's not something I like about myself. I pride myself as a comic reader by showing people all of the gems in my pared down 6,000 comic collection. You know what I mean? Like, there's something really fucking gross about that. But it goes along with like this whole thing about how we start to build parts of our identity around commodity. Disney adults and shit like that, like where it's like people find a part of themselves or attach a part of themselves to a commodity so they become more entrenched in the commodification of that thing and themselves as an extension of it. It's fucking wild.
The reason I am so like shaking my head, you know, is because we're doing it right now. You know, I mean, we're conscious of it at the very least, but like my shelf grows ever larger, right? Yeah. I have a list of books that it's like I intend to read these. For what purpose? To do the communism, you know? It's not a struggle. Like, it doesn't hurt me internally or anything, but it's something that I do think about every now and then. Like, I really have to be careful about how many books I'm ordering, you know, how many books I'm getting, reading books before I order other ones, just because I also have that hoarding impulse, dude. I mean, when I was in high school, I got into music broadly, and I was like out of control. You know, I had like 18,000 albums saved on my computer at one point, which I still have many of on a hard drive, and I occasionally will open up and just like scroll through the collection, because just looking at the collection, I don't listen to any of those albums. You know, not that I haven't. I have listened to almost all of those albums.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's like the hoard is what appeals to me. You know, the fact that I have the knowledge of all of these artists, whether I really like that music or not, was like deeply appealing to me.
I feel like there would be a difference if you were collecting physical media, though. Like,
Yes.
I don't know if it's more ideologically pure that you, I would have presumed, pirated a lot of those things, or at least got them.
Oh, I didn't buy a single one of those. Are you joking?
Yeah, so I mean, like, there's something at least a little bit more pure in that. And it's like, I'm here for the enjoyment of the art, not for the commodification of that art.
But the abundance is what fucks me up. You know, it's that like, these commodities are out there and now I must have them, you know, on my Dragon's pile of fucking albums, you know.
Dragon's pile.
You know, I didn't want to say hoard again. Yeah. You know, in my ancient vault of Aphex Twins records or whatever, you know what I mean? The 4 lines of just every Zappa record out there. Like,
and you know, I rationalize my tendency toward hoarding and my collector's impulse as like squeezing the little bit of joy out of this fucking bleak existence that I can. I like reading comics. I like looking at comics, and so I find some joy in that. And that's me falling victim to and allowing myself to be eaten up by the spectacle.
You know what's so interesting, though, is that we didn't talk about this in the Marcuse either, but both Marcuse and Debord talk a lot about truth versus false, right? Like true consciousness versus false consciousness, right? True enjoyment versus false enjoyment. When it comes to things like that, that's where it starts to get a little murky, right? There is a part of me that does enjoy, like truly, all of these things, but how much of that enjoyment comes from the society built around me? You know, how much of the spectacle is influencing my enjoyment, right? How much of that enjoyment is true?
Yeah.
And what I was thinking about earlier when you were talking about your time problem, you have all this time and you feel like you're wasting a bunch of it. Well, my first thought, my like Reddit brain reaction was like, time wasted and enjoyed is not wasted at all.
Yeah.
But did you truly enjoy it? You know, if I'm just sitting around watching YouTube, I don't know if that's like actual satisfaction, you know, and it starts to get like too metaphysical here. You know, it's like, who are you to fucking say that I'm not truly enjoying this? God damn it. But
well, and I think like the thought that like I'm wasting this time comes from the conditioning that we have under capitalism, where it's like, well, if I'm not being productive, quote, literally producing something probably for someone else, then that's time wasted. That's just me falling victim to the brainwashing. So I think like, well, any time that I spend doing what I choose is time well spent, whether what I choose to do is partaking in something or sounds like I'm doing drugs.
My gut feeling is to push back on that, though, because if you were to reel back society all the way to the basis, if you were a hunter-gatherer sitting on your ass, then that time is wasted because the production would otherwise go to your survival.
Yeah.
Right? I think that instinct is there outside of capitalism. I do agree. I do absolutely agree that it's been like compounded extremely because of our capitalist productivity death drive. But there's part of me that feels that to do something is not unwarranted, you know, like, sorry, I'm serious. I think that people who get enjoyment out of doing nothing, meaning like watching YouTube or even scrolling TikTok, I'm actually really now this second starting to think that it's not true enjoyment, you know, like especially doom scrolling. When I scroll on TikTok, it is not to fulfill a need other than my neurons aren't firing currently, you know, and that is a reaction to the society around me, not because of something internal.
I think for most people, the reason you turn to scrolling on TikTok or whatever is because we can't stand to stay alone with our own thoughts for long enough to not be distracted. Sure. So we go to TikTok. So it's like, well, I don't want to have to deal with what's going on up here. So I think that there's a big part of it, of that. And I agree with your assessment also. I think like my problem with where I'm at is like, yes, it's not inherently wasting my time just because I'm not producing something for someone else. But also, I have a desire to see certain things happen, to see the world shaped in a certain way. And any time that I'm not moving toward that is time wasted because it's not doing anything practical to move the needle in that direction.
You know, I think that this is outside of the discussion of the spectacle, but I think that comes from the fact that the time runs out, you know? There's a link to death there, right? And I was just thinking about how that's the opposite of what Debord is saying when he's talking about how the commodity, the spectacle, essentially removes you from the idea of dying as a whole. You know, like advertisements say you can't grow old. You know, like that's like the one rule of advertising is that you're not allowed to grow old. But I'm looking at 160 here. The irreducibly biological element which remains in labor, both in the dependence of the natural cycle of waking and sleeping and the existence of irreversible time in the expenditure of an individual life, is a mere accessory from the point of view of modern production. Consequently, these elements are ignored in the official proclamations of the movement of production and in the consumable trophies which are accessible to the translation of this incessant victory. I really love when he says, life insurance advertisements suggest merely that he is guilty of dying without ensuring the regularity of the system after his economic loss. And that's what it made me think of, you know? This drive to do something productive is the understanding that the time is limited, that there is an infinite time in the world, and that if you want these things to happen in a long scale, then it requires stuff to be done, you know, that you don't have enough time to do it. So I don't know. I don't think that this is relevant to the conversation. That was just an interesting aside there. There is an interesting connection to what Debord has to say about death here, but I think it's in contradiction to what he's saying about death. That productive drive has to do with the irreversibility of time. And it's the opposite of what he's saying here, where he's saying that the irreversibility of time is ignored by the mode of production because it would be a hindrance. Maybe it would be a hindrance to the spectacular mode of production, wherein you would realize that this labor is not actually beneficial to anything that I would want to complete in my lifetime. See, this is the problem. I don't know.
That section, what spoke to me about that was more on in 157.
Okay.
Where he's kind of talking about living ahistorically, meaning like we live outside of history because the spectacle has no room for things to be permanent. And so we are effectively rudderless because we don't know or understand history, what it brought us to where we are. And we essentially are always existing on an island then of the moment, rather than seeing ourselves situated in some greater timeline. Because he says in 157, the lack of general historical life also means that individual life as yet has no history, and that it is, quote, soon forgotten due to the increasingly frenetic replacement at every pulsation of the spectacular machinery. I was thinking a lot about the news cycle, social media.
Yeah.
Nothing is valued because nothing is remembered. And so that leaves us in this space where it's just kind of like, do we understand mortality, I guess, ultimately, that time is limited for us as individuals. Do we truly understand that? Because the spectacle perpetuates this constant recycling of time in a way that leaves us completely rudderless.
Yeah.
He also says that time is smothered by the spectacle's false memory of the unmemorable.
Okay, it's actually a little bit starting to click here. The spectacle insists upon a pseudo-cyclical time because cyclical time, the actual cycles of nature, would propel us to certain things. For one, sleeping and waking, but also the fact that we're going to die, you know, like that's a shock to your life and what you're doing in it. And the spectacle aims to downplay that via all sorts of things, you know, mostly commodity. But also, I mean, just like thinking about time-saving technology like instant soup and faster cars, you know, think about all of the life-extending products that we have. But in reality, we haven't seriously extended our life expectancy all that much in the grand scheme of things. I mean, yes and no.
I mean, my feeling about that has always been like, why do I want to extend this life?
Yeah.
What is the fucking purpose of living to 80 instead of 65 when the last 15 years of my life are fucking misery because I broke my back?
Yeah,
you know?
man.
Because I've never been able to take care of my body in a way that has made it meaningful.
Okay, let's talk about his critique about contemporary communisms.
Yeah, largely Stalinism.
Yes, which understandable, but also Leninism. I mean, Bolshevism et al. Also Chinese communism. Also, essentially every existing leftist belief since the beginning of time he critiques here. And then he says, what will work? Well, the one that nobody's successfully done yet. The one that lasted a month in Paris, 1871. Sorry to start that off so cynically, but he really does talk about every fucking flavor of leftism from the get-go, right? He talks about utopian socialism. He talks about the Second International. He talks about anarchism. He talks about organized anarchists. A hilarious aside, by the way, is when he says that the actions of individual anarchists are mostly laughable throughout history. That really cracked me up. He talks about Lenin. He talks about Stalin.
He talks about Mao.
He talks about Mao, right? He says that the concentrated form of the spectacle exists in China. If every man must read Mao and thus be Mao, it is because Mao is the only kind of man that can be.
Exactly.
Which is a fucking incredible quote, by the way, even if I don't necessarily agree with it, because we read Mao.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to be Mao.
Yeah, but he says on paragraph 64, this is at the very end, the penultimate sentence, if the entire Chinese population has to study Mao to the point of identifying with Mao, this is because there is nothing else they can be. The concentrated spectacle implies a police state.
Yes, so does the police. Yeah, a great parallel with Marcuse. I mean, I think that you can see the basis of their philosophy, and is that both of them are leftists. Both of them are communists, right? Both of them are Marxists, and they are dissatisfied with both sides of the current equation, right?
Yeah.
We are obviously against capitalism, they say, but also this communism isn't doing so hot either. And I'm not saying that they were just trying to rationalize why they were doing so poorly in the USSR. That's not what I'm saying. But they are looking for an alternative explanation to why the USSR didn't achieve perfect communism in their pipe dream minds. And for Debord, he says that it's just because of the top-down bureaucracy, right? He says essentially exactly what Parenti's criticism of pure socialists is that they say there just should have been more workers' control. There should have just been more bottom-up organization.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Bureaucracy and the bureaucratic class is basically the start and end of his criticism of Stalinism.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It's understandable. The more I learn about the Soviet Union, the less I like about it, which is unfortunate to say. You know, it feels bad. But just to talk about that for a second, just because they weren't perfect doesn't mean they couldn't become something better, right? Like, the dissolution of the Soviet Union is objectively a catastrophe historically in every regard. So, yeah, you know, he even says it in here. He says that capitalism loses its adversary, right? The faltering of the bureaucratic apparatus is an issue for capitalism, too. It's not favorable for the development of capitalism because capitalism at least had something to point at and say, we need to beat that. You know, that really spoke to me.
I have a quote that does speak to me a bit, but I don't know. Fuck it. Let's just go. On 106,
okay.
He's talking about his criticism of Stalinism is effectively that he thinks Stalin is a totalitarian, and he has invented this bureaucratic class of despots in the USSR without acknowledging that they are a bureaucratic class of despots in the USSR. And in 106, he says exactly that. The more powerful the class, the more it claims not to exist, and its power is employed above all to enforce this claim. And I think implicit in that is a criticism that you spend so much time arguing that you're not some sort of bureaucrat that you lose focus of the things that force you into bureaucracy in the first place. And I think that there can be something legitimate in that, and that focus gets lost because you don't exist in a vacuum. And so I don't think it's a fair criticism of the USSR and Stalin in general, because I think it is that kind of like you pointed to Parenti's talking about the pure socialist idea. I think that that's foolhardy, but there's a grain of truth to it.
Yeah, I mean, the acknowledgement of the bureaucracy as a class, I think, is one that is important, right? He even says that was Trotsky's main struggle with the Fourth International. Even if he had separated himself from what he had found to be inexcusable with Stalin, the issue wasn't with Stalin. It was the fact that the bureaucratic class existed as a separate power. You know, it even made me think about, I know we've moved away from this, but when we're talking about all sold labor creating all produced commodities, how Debord says that services have sprung up as a tertiary sector, right? A place to then expend all of this excess labor as technology increases. Yeah. And I feel almost, in that moment, I felt almost the same about bureaucracy, because in the Soviet Union, what did Parenti say? He said that, like, the administrative apparatus, like literally the Politburo, the nomenclatura, etc., was massive, right? To what extent was that body simply a tertiary body that was then created to take the exhaust, essentially, you know? It's not an exact parallel, but there is something similar there, you know? The bureaucracy is something that is becoming existent. It's coming into existence because of that growth. And it even actually reminds me of a quantitative growth leading into a qualitative change. You know, it's just not the qualitative change we wanted, right? The Soviets had to, Debord says, right, that the practical application of the theory comes from something that exists within history already. The application of the revolutionary theory in the Soviet Union came from the existence of the Soviets in history. The Soviets were an apparatus that existed outside of the theory that then, with the theory, propelled the USSR to have their revolutionary moment. And he's saying the same thing here. The bureaucracy was an apparatus that existed alongside, and its existence, along with the force of Stalin's revolutionary theory at least, propelled them into Stalinism. The quantity of the bureaucrats literally was increased to the point where it then underwent qualitative change. That bureaucracy was then a separate class, right? And not that I agree or disagree with what he's saying about Stalin, but I like his ultimate analysis where he says that Stalin is ultimately the person that decides whether you're a bureaucrat or not, which is true. Yeah. I mean, you're a Trotskyist, you're a Zinovievist, militarist, wrecker, or whatever. You're a white, a Makhnovist. All of those things, there were enemies abound, right? He's got an interesting critique, I'll say that much. I liked specifically his critique of the post-Stalinist leaders where they clearly want to move away from the Stalinist model, but in order to do that, they'd have to reject the one thing that keeps them in power, essentially.
Yeah, there is a quote for that.
It's on 110. What used to be terrorist has become a laughing matter, but this laughing matter maintained itself only by preserving as a last resort the terrorism it would like to be rid of. I was thinking a little bit of that Cultural Revolution video we watched a long time ago where they were saying that Mao wanted to shake up the party bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a problem. I think that that's something everyone can agree with. It seems to be something inherent to the party. But I think ultimately the problem with the Soviet bureaucracy is that there wasn't any bottom-up force, Yeah. It all came from top down.
Yeah.
And that was my initial discomfort with the party that I expressed anyway. It's just that I then bought into the party as a whole, whereas this makes me a little shakier on the party, obviously.
My relationship with the party is troubled at best. I think, what I see is I'm ideologically skeptical of the party.
Yeah.
Largely in the same way Debord is, because I think it has a tendency to perpetuate a lot of the things that it was created to stand against. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I recognize that,
there's something fucked up about it. He says that it comes out of Russia's backwardness, and there's a part of that I really don't like. It's almost like what you hear now, how people say that, there's an authoritarian spirit that is within Russia, Russia, I don't know. It's whack. And I can see where he's, just thinking about what Lenin has said about authoritarian rule from the top, where he laughs it off. I mean, he goes, he talks about fucking comradely brotherhood or whatever. Everyone's in lockstep, comradely and whatnot. He talks about operating in Russia. It's silly to talk about from above, from below, because they mean the same thing. He's got such a crazy assumption about what it means to be in the party. There is an actual division. It's crazy to me that a communist can say there is a level of authority inherent within a workplace, but at the same time, when we crystallize that authority in the structure of a party, we're not doing the same thing. I mean, that was a little shaky, but you know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, I understand that kind of contradiction there about the larger transposition, and I agree. And I think that way back when in the State and Revolution episodes, I think my take was the success of the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and what followed was largely because Lenin was principled, and that if it were someone other than Lenin, he had every opportunity to become a despot, but he didn't because he had the right thing in mind. But that's why I'm putting that poorly, but it's the framework that allows that sort of exploitation was still present.
Yeah.
The idea that being in lockstep with some sort of comradely iron will where everyone sees the same thing would prevent that from happening. The opposite is true. Yeah. Everyone being in lockstep would allow it to happen.
Because they just follow your orders then, comradely.
Exactly. And so my take back then was it's a shame that Lenin died when he did,
Yeah.
because, like, with him died that ideological steadfastness.
I'm thinking about his testament. Debord mentions his testament here for a moment. And he says that Trotsky, he was like pissed off at his colleague for publishing it. Lenin left a last will and testament when he died, and he criticized the party heavily, and he criticized Stalin heavily.
Yeah.
Whether that means he was pointing to Trotsky next is up for debate, obviously. But, motherfucker, why did you have to go and die? You son of a bitch. Yeah, that sucks. Fucking Lenin, dude.
That's the state problem, right? It's
Yeah.
like you have to create an apparatus that is able to do all of the things that you want it to do, but the creation of that apparatus also has all of these inroads for terrible shit to happen as well. And that sucks. But what is the alternative is the question.
Yeah, it's
Debord
not...
says it's worker collective.
He says nothing is what he says. He says nothing.
Yeah.
You
It's
know?
a hand wave.
Yeah. I wrote down, I have a whole fucking category that I wrote down where I just wrote, what do we do? And reading back at the quotes there, it's just dumb. It's not dumb. It's just like, seek the abolition of classes. Workers have direct position. The proletariat cannot come to power except by becoming the class of consciousness. The fusion of knowledge and action in such a way that guarantees the truth of the other. Wow. Awesome. Let me put that in my program, you know?
Yeah, I have this whole section where I just wrote, this is nonsense.
Yeah.
And that was optimistic. Like, I feel like he himself, this is when he's talking about the new signs of negation and stuff around the proletariat.
Mm-hmm.
I think he falls victim to all of the things that he's criticizing Lenin and Stalin and, to a degree, Trotsky for.
Yeah. I
So,
don't know.
yeah. Let's do the cavalcade of quotes.
It's the cavalcade of quotes.
In what seems to be a motif as we're reading all of this stuff, I see all of these parallels to the is-ought problem, the is-ought dilemma. I've mentioned it many, many times on the show up until this point. And in paragraph 12, Debord gives us his version. The spectacle presents itself as a vast, inaccessible reality that can never be questioned. Its sole message is what appears is good, what is good appears. He's defining the is-ought problem, the is-ought dilemma there as a part of the spectacle, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, I actually really like that because I was thinking about the suppression of the other. You know, if it doesn't appear, then it's simply, it did not ought to be. You know, it's bad, right? What we have is clearly the best option. That's why we have it.
Exactly.
Duh.
That's the whole premise of the is-ought dilemma, David Hume's is-ought problem.
Yeah.
And I appreciate seeing it in all of this work.
Hell yeah. Here's one on 28 that I really liked.
Okay.
The economic system founded on isolation is a circular product of isolation. The technology is based on isolation, and the technical process isolates in turn. From the automobile to television, all the goods selected by the spectacular system are also its weapons for constant reinforcement of the conditions of isolation of lonely crowds.
Yep.
Right? How many times have you heard, like, we're so much more connected and we're so farther apart, right? Or that cities are like the loneliest place, even though you're around everyone all the time.
Yeah.
In connection with that, there's a contradiction in the spectacle. This is much later. I'm not going to try to find the quote.
I think it's probably paragraph 65.
Where he says that the town, like yes, sir. Exactly. Irreconcilable claims crowd the stage of the affluent economy's unified spectacle. Different star commodities simultaneously support contradictory projects for provisioning society. The spectacle of automobiles demands a perfect transport network which destroys old cities, while the spectacle of the city itself requires museum areas.
We have such different translations.
Fuck.
But yeah, that example is perfect. The bottom of paragraph 19, he says, the spectacle does not realize philosophy. It philosophizes reality, reducing everyone's concrete life to a universe of speculation.
Hell yeah. Back on 65, actually, earlier I had mentioned the concentrated form of the spectacle in which all men must read Mao and then be like Mao because Mao's the only man you can be. In reflection of that, he also talks about the diffuse form of the spectacle, which I appreciated here because he says, the already problematic satisfaction, which is supposed to come from the consumption of the whole, is falsified immediately since the actual consumer can directly touch only a succession of fragments of this commodity happiness. There is a whole system where you could, just hypothetically, right? There is a system for the automobile in which everything is destroyed. It's all transport systems and you're in your car. That's the consumption of the whole, and it would fulfill you. The problem is that there are other things in the way, i.e. cities and museum areas, right? So it is impossible for us to consume in such a way that we will get the whole fulfillment, right? Because we only receive fragments of it.
Yeah.
Talks about celebrity a lot.
There is good stuff throughout this book. Definitely the stuff that resonated most with me was in the first probably 2, maybe 3 chapters.
Yeah.
But things that we didn't even talk about were his discussion around celebrity. On 60, he writes, as specialists of apparent life, stars serve as superficial objects that people can identify with in order to compensate for the fragmented productive specializations that they actually live. I think a lot about the kind of toxic parasocial relationships that a lot of people have with celebrity, and how that somehow gives us some form of vicarious gratification. Everyone loves that Tom Holland and Zendaya are together and are married and they're apparently happy, and it gives me some sort of personal satisfaction that they have a relationship. Who fucking cares?
It's honestly so crazy. I didn't even think about it, but it's just because they're both celebrities, right? Like, nobody's excited that fucking Keanu Reeves is dating a regular woman, you know? Like,
there's a lot of interesting stuff in there about celebrity, though. I'm going to go way back to paragraph 25. I haven't pre-read this, but I wrote banger cavalcade of quotes next to it. Religion justified the cosmic and ontological order that corresponded to the interests of the masters, expounding and embellishing everything their societies could not deliver. That's giving Opiate of the Masses to me in a way that's speaks to me as an atheist quite dearly.
Mine's I missed that completely because mine says the sacred has justified the cosmic and ontological order. So yeah, okay.
Wild.
The spectacle is a preservation of the unconsciousness within the practical change of conditions of existence. It is its own product and has made its own rules. It is a pseudo-sacred entity. I like that.
Pseudo-sacred. In contrast, the modern spectacle depicts what society could deliver, but in doing so, it rigidly separates what is possible from what is permitted. I was thinking a lot about the difference between possible and permitted.
Yeah.
Like, we could house every single person on Earth if we wanted to. We could provide health care to every single person on Earth if we wanted to. But what is possible and what is permitted are not equal. Like a factitious god, it engenders itself and makes its own rules. The spectacle.
I had mentioned this earlier, but I really like when he says that the bourgeoisie created an autonomous power which, so long as its autonomy lasts, can even do without a bourgeoisie. The machine never stops.
Yeah.
The machine never stops. On 138, he talks a little bit about millenarianism, which is an interesting concept. What millenarianism is a religious movement that basically says the end days are coming and then Christ, right? And Christ is going to bring utopia to the world. You know, there's a lot of millenarian revolts out there, but I always think of the Heavenly Taipei army in China. That's probably not right. There was a guy who was like, I'm Jesus's brother, and we're going to make a righteous and Christian nation here. Something along those lines. But if you're a historian of the Chinese variety, not that you're Chinese, but that you study Chinese history.
A historian of the Chinese variety.
Not that you're Chinese. If you're a Chinese history buff and you are fuming with anger at whatever I just said, just let it slide. just let it slide.
Leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah, leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. But just let it slide. Just let it slide. On 138... it says at the bottom, on the contrary, it is millenarianism, revolutionary class struggle, speaking the language of religion for the last time, which is already a modern revolutionary tendency, which is just really interesting to me. The spark of revolution exists throughout history. It's interesting to hear that specifically as like a kernel of revolutionary current speaking the last fragments of religious language. You know, that was interesting to me. You know, it's like you're seeing the contemporary revolutionary spirit, but it's still speaking the old language, which was enlightenment, etc. Anyway, leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. It is strictly forbidden to grow old. The social absence of death is identical to the absence of life.
That's good.
Yeah.
One on about time on 150 from 151 that I liked. The entire consumable time of modern society ends up being treated as a raw material for various new products put on the market as socially controlled uses of that time.
That's a great one. Damn, dude.
presented without comment, I guess.
Here's an interesting...
I don't have anything to say.
No, here's something interesting is that in the USSR, they tried to do a new calendar. They tried to construct their own time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah. What happened was, I don't know the exact, I think it was like an 8-day cycle or something ridiculous like that. Because what they wanted was to get rid of Sunday as a religious observant day, right? They wanted to crush religion, essentially. And so that didn't work. That didn't work out well. And then they did a 6-day calendar with the 7th day being Sunday, so people could still observe Sundays. And everyone was just like, why are we doing this? And then they gave it up. But, I think time isn't so rigid as we think. It's something outside of this book, but like there are cultures that have different senses of time. I know until like 1994, Ethiopia used a different calendar. Even the October Revolution took place in November, and it's because the Russians used the Julian calendar, not the Gregorian. So they were 13 days behind us.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that.
It is, isn't it? Pretty cool stuff. Damn, I had a great joke. Carissa actually had a great joke. I should give her credit. In number 3, he says, "It is the common ground of the deceived gaze." It sounds like us, pal. Gaze, yeah. The common ground of the deceived gaze. Yeah.
Anyway, that was The Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord.
Guy Debord. Was this book worth reading?
I think so. I mean, I've read it twice now at this point.
Yeah.
I think the caveat is I read this probably too early in my development as a communist. And so my takeaways were very surface level at that time. I felt more prepared for it this time, and still a lot of it went over my head, I would say. So I don't know. I think it's worth reading, but I think it's probably something that you should expect to revisit.
Yes, I agree. I would call this an intermediate read. It's not a no for me. I would say a yes, but only in the sense that I think that we're really desperate for contemporary perspectives, and this is from fucking 60 years ago, man. I think that we're in dire need of contemporary theory, right? And so I am in favor of reading more modern stuff. I am in favor of reading stuff that might address the problems that have come up with the historical application of socialism. That's completely acceptable. So I would say that I think that this is worth a read, but not first. I think that read this once you've formed an opinion. Maybe once you have a little philosophy in your pocket.
Yeah, I think even as a burgeoning Marxist, though, the commentary about commodification and alienation is useful and helped me understand kind of my relationship with commodity and my objectification as a commodity under capitalism. Also, even though we didn't talk about it at all, the idea of recuperation was a revelatory idea for me and really shed light on something that I had this innate discomfort with that I didn't understand how to articulate. Every time Pride Month comes around and fucking Coke has all of their different cans and all that sort of shit, I've always been so uncomfortable.
Yeah. Update all your apps so you can get the rainbow app icons,
Yeah, and it's like Debord helped me put words to that discomfort, even as a young idiot. So now as an older idiot, I still think it's worthwhile, but from a different lens.
Yeah, I would agree. Maybe not so much on the communism front. You're not going to figure out what is to be done from this, but I think it is a good one.
Well, were you left with any questions after tackling the text?
Yeah. What other small books can we read for this podcast?
Yeah.
No, I think that the question ever lingers, right? If not the party, then what? If the party, then what? That's really the big thing. It's like I can go either way, but I know that there are problems with either way. That's really what this brought to me. How do we escape commodity as a whole? I mean, commodities will still exist to fulfill our needs, but if we're talking about the consumer cycle of commodity production and labor exploitation, that's something that clearly needs to be broken.
Yeah, I would say I think Debord's criticism with commodity is a largely ideological one, and it doesn't exist in the practical realm because commerce will still exist under communism, commodities will still exist under communism. And I think Debord would still have an issue with commodity under communism. And so,
I'd like to read more. Not necessarily, but I would like to know more. I'd like to know if he has a more fleshed out interpretation of a workers' council is the better question.
Or even who does.
Yeah, right. I'm sure that there are people like that, Eurocoms, maybe? I don't actually know. Left comms especially have a lot of talk about workers' councils, that kind of thing. Hit us up.
leftunreadfeedback at gmail.com.
Yeah. If we missed anything as well, not only that, but also, what did you agree with? What do you disagree with? What did we miss? What else should we read? I normally have something funny to say here, but my brain is mush. What the dog do? Hit us up. leftandrandfeedback@gmail.com, as Aaron said. You can also follow us on TikTok. YouTube. Twitter. 0 posts, 0 followers, 0 following. But it's there. It's there. If you are part of the other Left Unread podcast, let's do a crossover. I would really love that, because as far as I have not listened to any of their stuff, but they're just two dudes that talk about history broadly.
Books, right?
Yeah.
Well, anyway, that would be cool. Let's do a collab.
Anyway, what are we reading next, Aaron?
Next go round, we are going to read Capitalist Realism. Is There No Alternative? By Mark Fisher.
Oh, yeah. It's a book that I have skimmed before. I've read half of it. I actually printed a copy when I used to work at Office Depot, and unfortunately, the PDF I had gotten did not have the back half of the book. So this will be my first time reading in full. Mark Fisher, I hear he's really good. I can't wait to read this a second time and actually read it in full. This time I won't feel like an idiot, so let's do the damn thing.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. So you too should get a copy of Capitalist Realism and read it ahead of the next episode.
Yes, it's so short. For the love of God, you can do it. I promise.
It's like 80 pages or something.
Go get it from Zero Books. You can listen to it on audiobook. I'm sure the whole thing is on YouTube. I'm sure the whole thing is on Spotify.
Yes, read along, because you don't
want to get left unread.
That's kind of a weird way to do that. Okay, bye.
See ya.